Hello and a really big warm welcome to this presentation from the Urban Penguin. My name is Andrew Mallett, and in today's presentation we're going to investigate the difference between login shells and non-login shells. Yes, I know, all you ever wanted to know about shells, but come on, let's go through and really discover what we're talking about. Hello and a really big warm welcome to the command line of my Ubuntu system. Now yes, I'm using Ubuntu, but it wouldn't really matter which Linux distribution that you're using. But we want to investigate some of the differences between login shells and non-login shells. The first thing I'm going to do is just type ps for my process state command. We can go through then see that I was running ps and that was running inside of a bash shell. But we have no idea whether that was a login shell or a non-login shell. If I use ps-f for a full listing, we're able to see that the bash command is prefaced by the dash symbol. This indicates that it's a login shell. The shell was instantiated during the login process. We can see the difference between a login shell and a non-login shell by just starting up another bash shell. Obviously, this bash shell was just executed. It wasn't started by a login process. When I take a look now at my ps-f, we're able to see then that I have a login shell and a non-login shell. The non-login shell is not prefaced then by the dash. So it's relatively easy for us to be able to go through, and using ps-f, we're able to see whether it was a login shell or whether it was created independently after login. If I clear the screen with Control and L, we're also then able to go through and start showing you other ways in which you can see and detect the login and non-login shells. To begin with, if we use sudo -i, this is going to give me an interactive shell if I'm allowed to run a shell as the root user. But it gives me a login shell. It clears my environment and completely resets it for our root user. If I go through and use the ps-f, we're able to see then that I've got a non-login shell, so it indicates as -bash. If I exit out of this, so returning back to my Vagrant account, if I use sudo and then -s, this just gives me a shell, but it will be a non-login shell. Now you can see that I am the root user. If I type ID, it still returns the user ID and group ID of root, but it's left me in my home directory. I'm still in the home and Vagrant directory. So I am the user, but we haven't reset the full environment because this is not a login shell. And we can prove that by running ps-f. And when we take a look at that, well, instead of just saying bash, it now shows /bin/bash, just giving me the full path to the shell. But it's not prefaced with the minus. So this is a non-login shell. Again, if I exit back as my Vagrant account, Control and L to clear the screen. We also have the command su for substitute user or switch user. We can use it independently, but I've created a new account quickly without a password. So I'm going to run it using sudo and su. If we use sudo to run the su command as root, we don't have to put in the user's password. If I use su minus is exactly the same as -l, so a login shell. But we've got a shortcut that we can just call it su minus. So su minus and su-l are exactly the same. If we don't specify the user that we are switching to the root account. But if we try, let's say, as the user Bob, the user account that I created, we switched through to Bob. And much in the same way as we did the sudo -i, we can see then that we are the user and we are in the user's home directory. So pwd, I'm in the user's home directory. ID, we are the user Bob. When we go through and take a look at our ps minus f, as this is a login shell, we can see then the minus bash. If we exit out of this and up arrow key, but this time, instead of using su minus or su minus l, we're just going to use su bob. So we're going to switch to the bob account, but this is going to be a non-login shell. So you can see my home directory hasn't changed. It's still home and Vagrant. But when we look at ID, I am the user Bob. So this was exactly the same as my sudo minus s. It gives me a non-login shell. And when I look at then ps minus f, we can see then that ps minus f is running inside of a bash shell rather than minus bash. So again, we can reiterate the fact that we can identify our login and non-login shells. If it starts with a minus, it is a login shell. Exit will then leave that shell, and Control and L obviously clears my screen. When we run a login shell, so minus bash, we execute the .profile login script from your home directory. So if I go through then and cat .profile is associated with login shells. One of the things though that we can see is that it does check if we have got a .bashrc file, the .profile will also then read in the .bashrc file. So the .bashrc file is always going to run, but the .profile only runs for login shells. When I clear the screen, when our non-login shell runs, we execute the .bashrc file. Again, from our home directory, this has got more information in it when we start looking at Ubuntu-based systems, so we've got quite a lot of lines, and we can see that most of the work is done in the .bashrc file. But if we don't need it to run every time that bash runs, we can go through and put it into the .profile, so it is set up when we log in and then carry forward to other shells. But hopefully this has given you a good idea of the difference between login shells and non-login shells, and how we can identify them using the ps-f command.
All that is left to say is thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, then you are probably sadder than I first thought. For more of this drivel, please subscribe, like and comment to @TheUrbanPenguin.